Hello students. Welcome to your chapter assessment of the nervous system. This chapter from the 11th edition, and these are good news, listen carefully. I was comparing, and actually I did several recordings from the 10th edition and the 11th edition. And the 11th edition, they have eliminated some topics. So I decided to go straight to the point. I already did my final exam and I made sure that the questions are the same, that covers the same topics, okay? Don't worry, you got this, okay? So what I wanna I'm gonna start with this chapter, which I really believe the presentation is much better than in the 10th edition. At least when you study, you have this video so you can see and compare. You are going to notice it, okay? The dermatomes are not there and some other portions, okay? But don't worry, everything is going to be fine, okay? So in this chapter, we're going to review Bell's palsy, the cerebration, decortication, electroencephalography, electromyography, Glasgow Coma Scale. Please pay attention to this because it's going to come in the exam. Guillain-Barré syndrome is coming. Level of consciousness, magnetoencephalography, myasthenia gravis is coming. Neurotransmitter, nystagmus, perla, physical disability, single photon emission, computer tomography, trigeminal neuralgia is coming in the exam. Okay, so the priority concepts of these chapters are mobility, cognition, and the interrelated concept for this chapter is sensory perception. The major divisions of the nervous system are the central nervous system, brain, and spinal cord. So the central nervous system is the CNS, right? And that is the umbrella for brain and spinal cord. And the peripheral nervous system, an autonomic nervous system, okay? The presentation of the nervous system and all the different diseases is something that we need to study. As a professor, I need to present this topic carefully because it's kind of not confusing, but there are many parts and people get discouraged easily to study the nervous system, okay? So I'm gonna help my presentation with videos, and it's gonna be easy to understand, guys. Okay, let's start with the CNS versus PNS. As I told you, central nervous system covering the brain and the spinal cord, and the PNS. Let's go.
Thanks for stopping by. This is 2 Minute Classroom, and today we're talking about the central nervous system versus the peripheral nervous system. If you're new here, welcome. My goal is to save you time and reduce your stress as a student by simplifying difficult concepts in only a few minutes. So if you want to spend less time studying and stressing and improve your grades, subscribe. And now onto the nervous system. Let's start with the central nervous system, or CNS. The CNS consists of the brain and the spinal cord. The brain is made up of the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. The cerebrum is divided into 4 major lobes: the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe, the parietal lobe, and the occipital lobe. Overall, the cerebrum is responsible for our higher level nervous system function, including memory, emotion, problem solving and reasoning, movement, and much, much more. The cerebellum sits on the back of the brain and plays a major role in movement, balance, and general motor control. The brainstem sits at the base of the brain and connects the brain to the spinal cord. It is responsible for regulatory processes like breathing, blood pressure, and eating. The spinal cord is a vital part of the nervous system that runs from the base of the brain down through the back. It acts as a communication pathway between the brain and the rest of the body. The spinal cord also plays a key role in controlling movement and sensation and reflexes, including the knee-jerk reflex. Now, onto the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is the part of the nervous system that is outside the brain and spinal cord. It includes all the nerves that reach every part of the body, such as your limbs, organs, and other structures. The PNS is divided into two main parts, the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system controls voluntary movement and sensation in the skin, muscles, and joints. It is responsible for relaying information from the brain to the skeletal muscles, allowing us to move our limbs and perform other voluntary actions. The autonomic nervous system, on the other hand, controls automatic functions such as breathing, heart rate, and digestion. It is responsible for relaying information from the brain to the internal organs, allowing our body to function without conscious control. The autonomic nervous system is further divided into two branches, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. These two branches work in opposite ways. The sympathetic branch increases activity to the organs, and the parasympathetic branch decreases activity to the organs. If you have a test coming up, check out my test prep playlist or my helpful test prep resources.
Thank you so much for your collaboration in this course. Okay, so we already learned what is the central nervous system, the peripheral nervous system. And after that, we're going to move to the basic unit of the nervous system, the neuron, which transmit impulses or messages. This is important. Some neurons are motor, causing purposeful physical movement or mobility, and some are sensory, resulting in the ability to perceive stimulation through one's sensory organs or sensory perception. Some process information and some retain information, which is cognition. Now, when a neuron receives an impulse from another neuron, the effect may be excitation, which is increasing the action, or inhibition, decreasing the action. So let's watch another video about the neuron. We're going to see the parts and everything. And this, I will strongly suggest you to view this video, to watch this video several times, because some of the diseases we are going to study later are related to the transmission between neurons, okay? So make sure you know this.
Communicates with itself both. Your body communicates with itself both electrically and chemically. Your nervous system, which includes your brain, spinal cord, and all of the nerves, will use electrical and chemical messages to allow you to move, smell, see, feel pain, and think. The nervous system is an internal communication system. The main cell of the nervous system is the neuron. The neuron transmits nerve impulses, which are electrical signals, and then it sends chemicals to the next neuron across a very small gap between them. The typical neuron has the same basic features. The cell body contains the nucleus and many organelles, and has long tendrils projecting from it called dendrites. These dendrites pick up signals from their environment or other neurons. A signal will travel from the dendrite to the long axon. Some axons can be even several feet long. The axons carry the signal to the end of the axon, often called the axon terminal, where messages are then sent in the form of chemicals to the next cell. A nerve impulse travels very quickly, about 1 meter per second. But many nerve fibers have a way to transmit signals up to 100 times faster. Special cells, called Schwann cells, will grow around the axon in wrapped layers like a cinnamon roll. Each wrap creates a coating of myelin and phospholipid bilayers, which act similarly to an insulator on an electrical wire. In between each Schwann cell is a small gap of exposed axon called a node of Ranvier. These nodes are important for speeding up the impulse. In a myelinated axon, the electrical impulse jumps quickly from node to node instead of moving continuously along the length of the axon. This jumping of the nerve impulse is called saltatory conduction. Salta means jump in Latin. And impulses can travel up to 100 meters per second. That's fast. Thank you for watching this episode of Teacher's Pet. Don't forget.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay, so we are clear on the neuron, the parts of the neuron. I want you to be very careful in memorizing the nodes of Ranvier and also the Schwann cells, and how the chemicals, the neurotransmitters, are transmitted from the last part of the neuron to the dendrites, to the next part, okay? We have afferent neurons, also known as sensory neurons, are specialized to send impulses toward the CNS. CNS, the brain, and the spinal cord, away from the PNS, peripheral nervous system, meaning that the afferent neurons work from the spinal. They are sending messages from the spinal cord, of, meaning all the nerves that are bringing messages into the spinal cord. So the PNS are the neurons, the nerves that are in our extremities, in our arms, in our legs, right? Does not include the spinal cord. So all the parts of the body away from the spinal cord send messages to the spinal cord, right? Those neurons are called afferent because those are the ones that are sensory. And then this spinal cord is gonna send the message to the brain. That's the main activity route, right? That the afferent neurons are doing from the extremities, peripheral, right, into the spinal cord to the brain. And afferent, a good way to remember afferent neurons, what they are doing is the way, well, in Latin, a means amor. So afferent start with an A, amor. Amor is a feeling, it's love in Latin, right? So F, feeling, A, amor, F, feeling. So you can remember that. And the other one is called efferent neuron. So the efferent neuron starts with an E, which is exercise. It's a motor neuron, okay? Efferent neurons are motor cells that carry signals away from the CNS to the cells in the peripheral nervous system. So it's the inverse, the reverse, right? So the efferent neurons works in the central nervous system, meaning the brain and the spinal cord, and they send signals to the peripheral nervous system, all the extremities, arms, legs, okay? Now, something important when we talk about the parts of the neuron, the myelin sheath, we have to remember if the myelin is damaged, these impulses slow down. This can cause diseases such as multiple sclerosis, which is characterized with brain problems, optic nerves, and spinal cord issues. But that's why I say you have to remember. You have to remember your the parts of the neuron. Many axons are covered with myelin sheaths. As I was talking, a white lipid covering myelin axon appear whitish and therefore also called white matter. Non-myelinated axons have a grayish cast and are called gray matter. Okay, now another important part is to remember that each neuron produces a specific neurotransmitter, for example, acetylcholine, serotonin, and can either enhance or inhibit the impulse, but cannot do both. Either inhibit or even enhance, but not both. Impulses are transmitted to their eventual destination through synapses or spaces between neurons, as we saw in the video. So we have these are two types, neuron to neuron or neuron to muscle, okay? Now, central nervous system, structure and function, the brain. I want you to watch this video, please. Let me put this video to understand the human brain structure and function.
Hello, welcome to Moo Math and Science. In this,
Put it forward.
the parts of the brain And this is very appropriate for middle school and late elementary students.
Yes, I chose very easy videos.
The top of the brain is called the cerebrum. It is separated into 4 lobes: the temporal, the parental, occipital, and the frontal. The cerebellum, also called the little brain, controls coordination, balance, and helps us talk and walk. The temporal lobe helps us process sounds. In other words, it helps us hear. It also helps with some balance. The parental lobe is also called the association lobe because it communicates with the other lobes. The parental lobe is where information such as taste, temperature, and touch are integrated or processed. The occipital lobe is responsible for your vision. The frontal lobe is responsible for your executive function. This includes your memory, impulse, control, your emotions, planning, and organization. The brain is connected to the spinal cord at the brain stem. The brain stem controls the flow of messages between the brain and the rest of the body. It also controls very basic functions such as your breathing, heart rate, and your blood pressure. Thanks for watching Moo Math and Science.
Thank you so much. So it was very nice to watch this video, right? So we have the brain, and we have inside the brain the meninges. Okay, these form a protective covering of the brain and the spinal cord. The outside layer is the dura mater. The subdural space is located between the dura mater and the middle layer, the arachnoid. And then we have the pia mater. So I want you to watch another video to understand better, because in my experience, people get very confused with the meninges, okay? Let's clarify.
Welcome to 2-Minute Neuroscience, where I simplistically... In this installment, I will discuss the meninges. The term meninges comes from the Greek for membrane and refers to 3 membranes that surround the brain and the spinal cord: the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. The meninges protect and provide structural support for the brain, as well as contain cerebrospinal fluid. The outermost layer of the meninges is the dura mater, which literally means hard mother. This thick and tough layer adheres to the skull on one side and the arachnoid mater on the other side. The dura provides the brain and spinal cord with an extra protective layer, attaches the brain to the skull and the spinal cord to the vertebral column to keep them from being jostled around, and provides a system of venous drainage through which blood can leave the brain. The arachnoid mater gets its name because it has the consistency and appearance of a cobweb. It is much less substantial than the dura. Strands of connective tissue called arachnoid trabeculi stretch between the arachnoid and pia mater. These help to suspend the brain in place. Between the arachnoid and pia mater, there is also an area known as the subarachnoid space, which is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. The pia mater is a thin layer that closely follows the contours of the brain. It forms a tight membrane around the brain and spinal cord, acting as an additional barrier and aiding in the secretion and containment of cerebrospinal fluid. Blood vessels are held against the pia mater by connective tissue before they penetrate the brain. There is a space between the dura of the spinal cord and the bone of the vertebral column known as the epidural space. Analgesics and anesthesia are sometimes administered here. Also, the dura and arachnoid mater extend several vertebrae below the end of the spinal cord, creating a cerebrospinal fluid-filled area called the lumbar cistern, where there is no spinal cord present. Cerebrospinal fluid can be withdrawn from here because a needle can be inserted with little risk of damaging the spinal cord. Thus, the lumbar cistern is the site where cerebrospinal fluid is aspirated in a lumbar puncture, also known as a spinal tap. This is done, for example, to diagnose meningitis, a potentially life-threatening inflammation of the meninges.
Thank you. So, as you saw in this video, the dura mater is not the skull. And that's typically where people get confused between the skull, the dura mater, the arachnoid space, the pia mater. There is a lot of confusion, okay? You have to know exactly the difference between the dura mater and the skull. Okay, so we talk about the meninges, we talk about the major parts of the brain, and this part, for example, besides the division of the brain between lobes, the brain consists of three main areas: the forebrain, cerebellum, and brainstem. The forebrain lies above the brainstem and cerebellum and is the most advanced in function complexity. This area of the brain is further divided into the three areas: the diencephalon, cerebrum, and cerebral cortex. So the diencephalon, which lies below the cerebrum, includes the thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus. The thalamus is the major relay station or central switchboard of the CNS. The hypothalamus plays a major role in automatic nervous system control, controlling temperature and other functions and cognition. The epithalamus connects the pathway to regulate emotion and contribute to a smooth voluntary motor function. Okay, so you have a very nice graphic here. The cerebrum is the largest part of the brain and controls intelligence, creativity, and memory. The gray matter of the cerebrum is the central cortex. The cerebrum consists of two halves. We know that, and those are referred to as the right hemisphere versus the left. And we know that the right controls the left side and the left controls the right. However, the left hemisphere is the dominant in most people, even in many left-handed people. The cerebral cortex is part of the cerebrum and is involved in almost all of the higher functions of the brain. The cerebral cortex is so complex that it is further divided into 4 lobes. We discussed this in the video: the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and occipital lobe. So the way I remember the lobes of the cerebral cortex are nurses are looking for full-time positions. Full-time is full, F is front, time is temporal, position is parietal and occipital, right? Full-time positions. Those are the temporal, the frontal, the temporal, the parietal, and the occipital. Now, the human brain structure and function video, I put it here in this area, but also it's a great video and you can play it in this area when you are studying. I'm gonna submit all these videos as usual in the supplemental file. Now, the frontal lobe, what I really want you to know is the Broca speech center on the dominant side. The Broca speech is in the frontal lobe, okay? And access to past information or experience is memory, okay? It's the same as describing this as memory. And that's another thing that is good to know. The frontal has the memory aspect of the brain, and the Broca speech. Both are good to know. Parietal lobe, we have this for your reading, so you can enjoy the reading here. And then we have the temporal. The Wernicke area for language comprehension is in the temporal, and that's another good to know. Then we have the occipital lobe, which is primarily your visual center. Here comes another good to know. The cerebellum receives immediate and continuous information about the condition of the muscles, joints, and tendons. Cerebral function enables a person to keep an extremity from overshooting an intended target, move from one skilled moving to another, predict distance, or gauge the speed with which one is approaching an object, control voluntary movement, maintain equilibrium. That's the cerebellum, okay? The cerebral control of the body is ipsilateral, situated on the same side. The right side of the cerebellum controls the right side of the body, and the left side of the cerebellum controls the left side of the body. So there is here another that's good to know, talking about the cerebellum. A client who has cerebral function impairment should not be driving, for example, right? And that's another good to know, critical thinking. Now we have another part, is the brainstem includes the midbrain, pons, and medulla, and then controls awareness and alertness. Now we're going to watch a video talking about, but before that, we're going to get deep into the brainstem functions. The medulla, for example, is controls the cardiac, respiratory, cranial nerve 9. We're going to talk about the cranial nerves later. But you see that the medulla has a lot of important functions. Medulla, okay? Main, cardiac, respiratory. Aren't they a main part of the body functions, right? Then we have pons. It's talking about the control of the cranial nerve nuclei 5, which is a trigeminal. Number 6, number 7, we're going to talk more in details about the cranial nerve. The pons is cardiac acceleration and vasoconstriction. This part, even though we are not yet in the part of the cranial nerve, I want you to pay attention. This is good to know. We need to review what is the function of cranial nerve nuclei 5, 6, 7, and 8. That's good to know. The midbrain contains the cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius. The cranial nerve 3 is the oculomotor, and 4 trochlear. And this is another good to know. This is another good to know. I forgot about this. Okay, that's good to know. Okay, very good. So now that we spoke about this area of the brain, which is the brain stem and the 3 parts, medulla, pons, and midbrain. Okay, now we're going to talk about the circulation of the brain. Here is the video. Okay, here we go.
This is Dr. Cal Shipley with a review of the blood supply to the brain. Blood is supplied to the brain by 2 pairs of arteries. The anterior supply supplies blood primarily to the middle and front portions of the brain and consists of the left and right carotid arteries. The posterior supply supplies blood primarily to the brainstem and back portions of the brain and consists of the right and left vertebral arteries, which then join together to form the single basilar artery. Rotating the brain so that we have a view from the left side, we can now more clearly see how the anterior supply, originating from the carotid arteries, distributes blood primarily to the middle and front portions of the brain. 2 of the major arteries in the anterior circulation are the anterior and middle cerebral arteries. And the posterior supply, originating from the basilar artery, supplies mostly the brainstem and the rear portions of the brain. The posterior cerebral artery is a major vessel in the posterior circulation. Excellent. And in a prime example of nature's wonderful design, there is a communicating artery which joins the 2 systems. Known as the posterior communicating artery, this vessel is part of the circle of Willis. In the event that there is sudden impairment of blood flow to the brain from either the anterior or posterior system, the communicating arteries allow for crossover flow, which may help to prevent damage to the portion of the brain affected by the impaired flow.
Thank you so much, doctor, for your explanation. So we know then, and we can understand when they talk that the problem is in the basilar artery, you know what part of the brain is affected, right? So now the blood-brain barrier seems to exist because the endothelial cells of the cerebral capillaries are joined tightly together. This barrier keeps some substances in the bloodstream out of the cerebrospinal circulation and out of the brain tissue. What important is the blood-brain barrier? Substances that can pass through the BBB includes oxygen, glucose, carbon dioxide, alcohol, anesthetics, and water. Let me repeat again. The substances that can pass through the blood-brain barrier includes oxygen, glucose. Think about your diabetic patients when they are having these complications in the mobility, or maybe they are having brain fog, okay? Carbon dioxide, alcohol, anesthetics, and water. Large molecules such as albumin, any substance bound to albumin, and many antibiotics are prevented from crossing the barrier. Okay, cerebrospinal fluid also circulates, surrounds, and cushions the brain and the spinal cord. Let's watch a quick video. I have selected videos of 1 minute, 2 minutes, so guys, you can understand in small videos.
Barrier. For example, they seem to be involved with signaling.
Okay, let me put it from the beginning.
Welcome to 2-Minute Neuroscience, where I simplistically explain neuroscience topics in 2 minutes or less. In this installment, I will discuss pain and the anterolateral system.
I think I'm in the wrong video. Sorry about that. Okay, let me start again. It happens in the best families. Okay, let's see. Let me put it from the beginning.
Neuroscience topics in 2 minutes or less. In this installment, I will discuss the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier is a complex that surrounds most of the blood vessels in the brain. It acts as a barrier between the bloodstream and the extracellular space of the brain, allowing only certain substances like water, oxygen, and small lipid-soluble substances to easily cross from the blood into the brain. This prevents toxins, pathogens, and other potentially dangerous substances from crossing from the circulatory system into the brain. It is thought that the central components of the structure of the blood-brain barrier are the tight junctions of endothelial cells, the cells that make up the interior surface of blood vessels. In other blood vessels throughout the body, there are small spaces between these endothelial cells. Small blood-borne substances can pass through these spaces and into surrounding tissues. The endothelial cells that make up the blood-brain barrier, however, are fused tightly together to form tight junctions that restrict diffusion across the blood vessel lining. Glial cells called astrocytes also have projections called astrocytic end feet that extend to the walls of blood vessels that are part of the blood-brain barrier. Astrocytic end feet often completely surround blood vessels in the brain and are thought to play critical roles in the formation of the blood-brain barrier. For example, they seem to be involved with signaling that prompts endothelial cells to form the tight junctions necessary to create the blood-brain barrier, and they are believed to have multiple functions involving the maintenance and regulation of the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier protects most of the blood vessels in the brain, but there are some areas that lack a blood-brain barrier, allowing substances to pass from the circulatory system to the brain and back. For example, the circumventricular organs are a group of structures lacking a blood-brain barrier that are centered around the ventricles of the brain. These structures are thought to be lacking a blood-brain barrier because their functions require access to the bloodstream. The posterior pituitary gland, for example, has to be able to release hormones directly into the bloodstream.
How important is to keep our body out of those toxins, because they are important part in the brain that do not have the blood-brain barrier, as you saw in the video, right? What is here? The spinal cord now. The spinal cord controls mobility, so we finish with the brain. Okay, regulates organ function, processes sensory perception, information from the extremities, trunk, and many internal organs, and transmit information to and from the brain. And that's good to know. Extremities are peripheral. In an older patient with age-related peripheral sensory perception, these sensory perception changes. Think about what activities are compromised when we have problems with the peripheral sensory perception. Now we are going to get into our cranial nerves list, and I want you to make the difference between your sensory and the motor nerves. So the olfactory is cranial nerve number 1, number 2 the optic. I really want you to focus on the oculomotor. That's good to know. The oculomotor, eye movement via medial and lateral rectus and inferior oblique. Anyway, this oculomotor cranial nerves is in charge of the pupil constriction. Okay, that's good to know. And then we have the trigeminal, which is located in the pons. This has double functions, sensory and motor. Okay, and that's another good to know. Then we have the facial, number 7. Is also a double work neuron. It has sensory and motor. Pay attention to this, and also works in the parasympathetic nervous system. Then we have the glossopharyngeal, another cranial nerve with double job, sensory and motor, located in the medulla. The vagus, okay, is another sensory motor cranial nerve. There are different mnemonics to remember your cranial nerves. It's all about how you are comfortable with that. Some of them are full with adjectives or names or events. Some others are a little bit more naughty. They talked about sexual components. So it's up to you. Try to search in YouTube how to remember 2 things. How to remember the cranial nerve number, like for example, cranial nerves 3, and what is the function, if it's sensory or motor. So you have to learn the cranial nerves in that way, not only the number, but also the function, okay? Peripheral nervous system, structure and function. The peripheral nervous system is composed of spinal nerves, cranial nerves, and autonomic nervous system. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves, 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal existing from the spinal cord. Each spinal nerve is responsible for the muscle innervation and sensory perception of a given area of the body. The cervical, for example, and thoracic spinal nerves are relatively close to their areas of responsibility, whereas the lumbar and sacral spinal nerves are some distance from theirs, because the spinal cord ends between lumbar 1 and lumbar 2, the axons of the lumbar and sacral cord extend downward before exiting at the appropriate intervertebral foramen. So this is the part of the Ignavicius edition 10th that shows the dermatomes, but here they are not mentioning that in that deep, and they are not testing you in that. I have checked the test bank. There's no questions related to that. The reflex arc is closed circuit of spinal and peripheral nerves and therefore requires no control by the brain. Reflexes consist of sensory input from skeletal muscles, small cells in the spinal cord, anterior motor neuron. And we know we have 12 cranial nerves. So the autonomic nervous system, the structure and functions, is composed of 2 parts, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system cells originating a gray matter of the spinal cord from T1 through lumbar 2 or 3. The sympathetic nervous system does not have any relation with the cervical. Okay, it's from T1 thoracic to lumbar 3. This part of the ANS is considered thoracolumbar because of its anatomy location. The sympathetic nervous system stimulates the function of the body needed for fight or flight, heart and respiratory rate, which are covered in that area from thoracic number 1 to lumbar 3. Remember, the cervical is not included in the sympathetic nervous system, does not have any relation with the respiratory or the cardiac area. It also inhibits certain functions not needed in urgent and stressful situations. The parasympathetic cells originate in the gray matter of the sacral area of the spinal cord from sacral 2 to sacral 4, plus portions of cranial nerves 3, 5, 9, and 10, the craniosacral. That's why I told you that you need to double check in deep what are the functions of cranial nerve 3, cranial nerve 7, 9, and 10 in relation to the parasympathetic. Okay, let me read it again. The parasympathetic cells originate in the gray matter of the sacral area of the spinal cord, gray matter from the sacral area from S2 to S4, plus portions of cranial nerve 3, which is in charge of the pupil constriction, okay, cranial nerve 7, 9, and 10. The parasympathetic nervous system can slow body functions when needed and contribute to digestion or reproduction. Of course, they are in the area of the gastrointestinal S2 and the reproduction between S2 and S4. Make sure you understand this, and I don't want you to get confused that the sacral has any relation with the cranial nerve 3, which is in charge of the pupil constriction. Okay? Make sure, get deep into this knowledge, and when we come back, we are going to check the neurology changes associated with aging. So far, we have finished with the anatomy and physiology of the nervous system.